So today's presentation is about knowledge. The title's Knowledge of Everywhere, but Not a Drop to Think. It's just play on words from a famous line from a famous poem about a man who's surrounded by water, but he's in the sea, so it's not drinkable water. And I think that this is an apt representation of our world today, and it's surprising just how often this comes up. So I want to remind you of something if you're old enough to have seen the Aladdin cartoon. There's this iconic scene where Aladdin meets the genie, and he expands into this huge, monstrous red version of himself, and he's describing what it's like to be him. And he says, in complete exaggerated Robin Williams style, phenomenal cosmic power, itty bitty living space. He's this huge, powerful genie, but he lives in this tiny lamp. And he has all this power, but he can't use it for just anything. There are rules. Our situation today is unprecedented. Each one of us has access to the accumulated sum of all human knowledge, at least what was recorded. And you can search it for free anytime you want. And most of us walk around with what years ago would have been considered supercomputers. Within our lifetime would have been considered supercomputers for most of us, depending on how old you are. And we walk around with that in our pocket or purse. We have constant access to this information. So the question is, how often do you use it? And to what end do you use it? And how effectively can you process that information? Now, this first question, how often do you use it? Is it an automatic step? And is it an early step? I think young people have an advantage on older people with this. And there's some exceptions. I've got friends who are older than me. And the very first thing they do when they want to look into anything is they hit ChatGPT or whatever they use. They have the app for it right there on their phone. Many people are growing up with that, and that's just all they know. And there are some definite downsides to this, okay? But I'm not going to talk about them in this presentation. I've talked a lot about the downsides of AI. But for those of us who have access to this information, is it something that we do automatically and early? And why would that be a good thing? In this case, there are downsides, but what are the upsides? Well, it turns out that we live in this information ecosystem. You scroll through social media, you're bombarded by information. We live in a world that's increasingly complex, and we need information to thrive in that environment. But it's not enough that it exists. This is the water everywhere, but not a drop to drink problem. It's not enough that it exists. We have to be able to process it. And the issue is we're being bombarded by this stuff whether we like it or not. And it's absolutely not just influencing your perspectives on things, but it's also dictating the set of options you're aware of and the cost and benefit that you perceive in each of them, that you estimate in each of these options. Life is a steady stream of choices. And if you're just sort of bouncing up against it randomly, and it's not an explicit process in your mind, and you're not trained on how to do it well, and it hasn't become second nature to do it well, you're absolutely going to experience a suboptimal life. There will be many problems that you face that will overcome you. You will have many perspectives that are dead wrong. The benefits that you obtain in life will be far less than what you could. And probably most importantly, you are going to be incredibly resistant to better ideas. And better actions that stem from those ideas, and more accurate feelings, and better feelings. So this is actually quite an important thing. Okay, so as an example of this, here is a very simple post I saw on X from some guy who is talking about the amount of carbon dioxide in the office where he works all day. He's in a little room, and he bought a carbon dioxide meter. He's quite concerned that the CO2 levels are too high. And so he asks a question. Does anyone know of a way beyond ventilation to reduce a room's CO2? Now, first off, posting a question on social media is a terrible way to find out good ideas about that question, good answers to the question, or looking for solutions to a problem. It's terrible because it's subject to all these filters of who's going to see that and who's going to respond. And if you look at the likelihoods, it's not very good. The odds that you're going to hear something that actually helps you, it's not very good. A Google search is much better. An AI search is much better. So, but here we have actual responses from actual people. And what do I mean by much better? The odds of you getting a good answer are much higher, subject to the limits of most people in processing information. So I can look at this and I can filter, pun intended, so we're talking about CO2 in a room, I can filter out the garbage very easily. I'm well versed in this sort of information judo kind of stuff. And there's a technical term for that, but whatever. But most people are not. Most people are very bad at this, and I'll talk about why a little later on. But here are some really interesting things that we can just look at right off the bat. The shocker is right in the middle, and I want to call attention to this. A bunch of people suggest getting houseplants in the room. And most people would hear that and say, well, I know that plants process CO2 into oxygen. So yeah, of course that would be a good idea. And this is precisely something that I want to point out about how important it is to make searching an automatic early step, even for things that you're confident about. Because in this increasingly complex world, you're probably wrong. You're either wrong in a light sense because something better or more correct exists, or you're just dead wrong. And this is a dead wrong case. And it's wonderful because so many people would agree with it, even though it's dead wrong. No amount of plants in a room will ever have a significant effect on the level of CO2 in that room. Just one person breathing is going to absolutely overwhelm anything that any amount of plants that could fit in a room could do. Now, I happen to know that because I have a weird fact that's unusual, which is that something like 3 weeks ago, I spent about a half hour researching if there was any reasonable way to reduce accumulated CO2 in a sealed space, because it was part of research I was doing about nuclear war preparation. Like how would you survive fallout? And the answer is there's nothing you can do besides make an air filter, right? And not to get into all that, the point is houseplants are a no-go. It does absolutely nothing. Now, they're nice. It's a nice vibe, but it will not make any significant effect on the CO2. And yet, here's 1, 2, 3, 4 people who suggested that. Here's the fourth one down here. This is as far as I scrolled. I didn't scroll through pages to get this. These were the first 3 views of the responses. So that's point number 1, is that when you look for answers among the crowds, just asking people, there's an abundant increase in blatantly false information that people will give you. Numerically, far and away the most numerous answer to this question was dead wrong. So much for the wisdom of crowds. There was a book written. It was actually quite influential. I think it came out in the late 90s. Don't quote me on that. It's called The Wisdom of Crowds. Now, the interesting thing is that that is used as a catchphrase in ways that actually are contradicted by the book itself, which is kind of funny and to the point in a way. But the crowds aren't wise. And in an increasingly complex world, you should expect that more and more people will be incorrect about more and more things. And that more and more people, even if they have a useful answer to something or something that's partially true or partially valuable, you should assume that something better is available. It should become an automatic early step to search for something better. Now, the wonderful thing about the modern world is you can do this in an extremely effective, fast, and inexpensive way. But we have to train ourselves to put this into the process. Now, just because I had these answers on the screen, I also wanted to briefly touch on some other potential responses and one principle here. So when you ask a question like this, you're also going to get this response from people who say this is not a problem. That's these two responses. This guy says, perhaps you should understand that this has been this way in enclosed spaces for humans for millennia. And a bunch of people like this and whatever. In other words, this isn't a problem. And this person gives another variety of the same. He says, your CO2 meter is clearly broken. In other words, there's no way that what you're saying is a problem is actually a problem. And you'll get this a lot. So people will try to shut down your question. And then over here, this was hilarious. I saw that Elon Musk had answered this random guy's question. And he actually gives a really good answer. And he talks about HVAC fans and filtration with HEPA filters. And it's a correct answer. It's highly informative. It was actually better than anyone else's answer in the three screens I looked at. And what's the principle here? Wisdom is not topical. Elon Musk, he's pretty high on the wisdom curve. I don't want to sidetrack into talking about wisdom and what that actually means, because the world doesn't really understand. But in a nutshell, knowledge is information and wisdom is the ability to find, filter, and use that knowledge. It's also the ability to produce it in the first place. Okay? So Elon Musk is a wise man. And it turns out that if you throw him into a big set of problems, he could probably outperform most people because of that wisdom. That's a property of wisdom. Wisdom is not topical. Knowledge always is. Wisdom never is. It's a huge difference. And in an increasingly complex world, the knowledge is there and it's free and it's abundant. The price of knowledge has gone to zero. That's not to say the benefit of it has gone to zero. The benefit has actually increased because in a more complex system, it's more important, like I said. But the price of knowledge has gone to zero. The price of wisdom has gone to infinity. They used to be pretty close. In a simple world, they're almost indistinguishable, which is one reason so many people have such a struggle to define and distinguish them. Because they grew up in a simpler world. But they're not the same. They're very different. And the difference between them is accelerating. I should say the obviousness of the difference between them is accelerating. Okay, next question. How often do you search for what others have done before you try to solve a problem? So I remember back in grad school, I had this wonderful teacher in this wonderful class. And he was very seasoned. He had been there. This was his last semester teaching. He had been there forever. And I will never forget that it was a course on scientific writing. It was a great course because it taught so much more than that. But he drummed into our heads over and over and over again that when you're addressing a problem, you ask the following questions. 1, what is the problem? 2, why does it matter? 3, what have others done to solve it? 4, why were those solutions insufficient? 5, what's your solution? And 6, how do you prove it works and is better than everything else? And the effectiveness of his repetition is witnessed by the fact that I remember this. It's one of the very few things I don't think I'll ever forget. And I've used that formula again and again and again in life. It's a wonderful formula. So going back to, I think, the third question, what have others done to solve the problem? This is not a question normal people ever ask. And it's increasingly foolish because we have access to so much knowledge. Now, having said all that, now I'm going to self-incriminate. So I made this mistake just, 2 weeks ago or something. And in my defense, I was super tired. I was trying to take advantage of like 4 minutes that I had. And my pressure washer last summer, the O-ring flew out of it just at the end of a project. And so I had set it aside knowing that before I used it again, I'd have to fix it. And I had gone through the trouble of along the way, as you probably know, if you've read Joy on Purpose, I stack related things together. And so however many weeks or months had gone by, and I ended up at a store that sells collections of O-rings like you see here for a very low price. And I figured I only need one, but if I buy one, it actually costs just as much as this whole set. So I'll just buy the set. Anyway, so I had this set and the day came where I needed my pressure washer. So suddenly that priority went to the top of my list in the 4 minutes that I had. And I thought that would be plenty of time to solve the problem. So I got my pressure washer out, and that was a hassle because things aren't arranged in my garage right now for spring and summertime. It's the winter configuration. And, it wasn't the easiest thing to get the pressure washer out to where I needed it in the yard. And the hoses weren't quite thawed out, and I had to find one that worked with that and attach it to the frost-free hydrant and run the line. And anyway, when I got to the end of that, I figured, well, at least now I just need to pop this O-ring in. And I spent about 40 minutes trying to get this O-ring on. And what I did was, I took a very clever approach to this, and I started at the O-ring size that I thought would be right. And that wasn't right. And so I skipped a couple and then tried that one, and that wasn't right. And I just did the Goldilocks jumping around, and that's going to be familiar to, that approach is familiar to anybody who's familiar with searching in computer science, like a binary search, for example. And so I did this in the highest efficiency way I could think of, and I could not understand why none of these were working. Every time I tested the pressure washer, it was still leaking as if there wasn't an O-ring in it. And so I paused and I thought, actually I came in and let my wife know what was taking so long because I think it was dinner time. And she said, well, why haven't you looked it up on the internet? And I thought, well, because I thought I knew how to do this, right? And I was like, yeah, it's time to do that. My hands are so cold I can't really type anymore, so let me go and look this up. And sure enough, I thought the O-ring, if you pull this shank down, I thought it went around this part, but it actually goes inside. And I thought, oh yeah, that makes a lot more sense. And I felt like an idiot on about 3 levels. So there you go. How often do you search for what others have done before you try to solve a problem? Because going back to that list of questions you ask when you're intending to publish the results of such a problem in a journal or something. If someone else has already solved it, you stop. If the solution is sufficient, you're done. You move on to something else. And that's good news. It's always easier to use a pre-existing solution for something than to come up with one for yourself. And this is another thing that modern people don't get. They think that innovation and reuse are pretty much the same. And pretty soon you get closer to this idea that we're all the same. Yeah, someone who invents a language is the same as someone who uses a language. They're pretty much the same. And if they're different, they're only a little different. Nope, that is dead wrong. Like if you put me on a desert island and I had to create this thing out of ore, start to finish, produce this thing, there's no way I could do it. This coupler. And I would get stuck long before those ball bearings became a huge issue, and they would be a huge issue. Okay, let's go on to the next question. How often do you check to see if something... Wait, didn't we just do this? No. How often... So you search for a pre-existing solution to a problem, but also how often do you check to see if something better than what you're already using exists? And just to keep on the same example quickly, suppose I know how to, and I do now, replace an O-ring on a pressure washer. Well, maybe the precise way that I do it isn't the best. Maybe I just use my finger to shove it in there, but there's actually a special tool for this, and there is. So maybe there's a better way, and maybe if I'm just doing one, it doesn't matter. But if my job is replacing O-rings, I probably want that tool. And you'd be amazed at what kind of tools are out there for all sorts of things. And usually it's an economies of scale thing where it only makes sense. If you're just going to paint one room in your house, you probably want to bust out the brushes and rollers. But if you have to do a lot more than that, maybe it makes sense to buy a sprayer. And so on and so forth. Well, here's another real world example that came up in recent life with a discussion I was having with a friend of mine who also publishes books. And he said that he uses Adobe Illustrator. And I said, how much does that cost? And he says, well, I get the suite because it ends up being a better price because it would cost almost as much for just this and whatever. So I think it comes down to $35 a month. All right. Well, I use this program called BookBrush, and it's about $8 a month, which I'm in conversation with him. I said, I was bringing up BookBrush as a cheaper alternative that could do what he needs to do for a lot less than what he's paying. But then I was thinking, and I was thinking out loud, I said this in the conversation. I said, but you know what? It's been an awfully long time. I think it's been at least 2 years since I started using that. And there's got to be something less expensive out there because it's so simple. What I'm doing is so simple. And I only use it about 2 times a year. And so sure enough, I did a Google search and I found this program called Canva, which I'm still in the process of testing to see how well that will work. It does have a free version, but I'm not sure if that version is going to have the features I need. But in looking into whether it would or not, I also found out that they give their premium version free to nonprofits. And so I've signed up. They have to verify the status of Upward Thought, and then I'll give it a try and I'll see if this works and I'll use it for the next book. And if it does, I save whatever that is, $100 a year, which is great. And you might think, well, who cares, right? Can't make that much of a difference. You'd be surprised how quickly $100 a year adds up. You'd be surprised. And not every value is what's the word I'm looking for? Not every kind of value is denominable in dollars, right? So your time is worth something, but there are other things too. The quality of your life. It's a subjective thing, but if you start stacking increases in value, you'd be shocked at the difference it could make and how quickly that diverges into something much better than what you had before. The next question is, to what end do you use it? So the vast majority of people use the internet and all the knowledge it offers us for debauchery. They use it for porn, for illegal things, for illicit things, whatever. In second place is entertainment. And entertainment has a time and a place, but it's way overused. It's way overused. So my kids know that when I come out of my little cave where I write all day, if I see them along my path to going to the bathroom, getting a drink or getting some food or whatever else I'm doing to take a quick break, watering some plants or something, they know that if they're just sitting around, I'm going to ask them, what are you doing and what could you be doing? Entertainment has a time and a place, and its place is to make you better at everything else. That's when it's appropriate. So if you're totally out of steam or it's a special occasion, great. But if you could be doing something more valuable, you should be doing something more valuable. And the same goes with the internet. If you're just farting around on YouTube all day, that's not why God gave us this blessing of the internet. And where much is given, much is expected. And what that means in this context includes the following. If you have access to solutions to greater problems, God is going to send you greater problems. You should think about that. And if you waste the time you could have been using doing better things, if you waste that time doing lesser things, when those problems come, they will overcome you. It's very important. So this knowledge, it's useful for many things. The internet is useful for many things, but what you should be using it for more than anything is improvement. That doesn't just mean self-improvement in the strict sense. You can use it for producing things of value. That's improvement too. Creation is improvement. All right. You could also say improvement is creation, but I don't want to digress there. The last question is, how effectively can you process it? So you have access to all this knowledge, but mixed into it is a bunch of rubbish. And there are things of greater value and lesser value. And there's this whole range of how accurately you can understand what's published. So, there can be a tutorial on how to replace an O-ring, and you could watch the video and completely misunderstand it and still do it wrong, even if the video is correct, even if the video is well done, right? So these are the kinds of things to think about when you're thinking about how effectively you process information. So let's go into some sub-questions to further explore this. How quickly can you process information? So in the diversity of humankind, there are people that can look at one page of information and say, I've got it, we're good, and it's true. It's true that they've got it and we're good. The same sheet of information could be shown to 8 other people who need a week or more to process it. And that divergence of efficiency might seem unbelievable to you, but I promise it's the case. Here's a really simple example. When I was, 14, I couldn't have been 14 because I think that would have been too young to have a work permit. at the time and place. But let's say 15. I didn't have a driver's license, so let's say 15 or 16. I got a job at a chain restaurant that was kind of like Denny's, but it was smaller, so you wouldn't know the name. But anyway, I got a job at this restaurant as a cook. And cook was probably too strong a word. We actually did have a grill and we had a deep fryer. We may have even had an oven, but it wasn't just heat and eat. There was some actual cooking involved. But, lightweight stuff. I wasn't at a 5-star Michelin whatever restaurant. Anyway, I got hired for the job and started working these really long shifts. And it was interesting because I think my second week, the manager asked me to train a new hire at my own job. And I said, there are people here who've been here like 7 years. Why are you asking me to do this? There's no way I know this job better than the people I'm working with. And she said, no, actually you do. So I was like, okay. So I started training people for this job that I had just showed up at. Right. And that's an example of this sort of thing. And you'll see this all of the time if you open your eyes. And why I say this is not to highlight the differences between people, but to highlight the potential of what you could do. The first step in doing something differently is knowing that it's possible. And this could even get back to the Roger Bannister principle, where he was the first person to run, what was it, a mile in less than 4 minutes, something like that. But everyone said it was physically impossible for years before that. And then after he did it, a bunch of other people did it right away. It was just a mental block of people, not just, right? This was an elite level of training, but the most effective obstacle, there were people who were in good enough shape to run that fast. They just didn't believe they could do it. So they didn't try. The next sub-question is, how accurately can you process information? What I mean by that, in part, is that there's bias in all sorts of information. A simple bias is the lack of counterpoints or alternative perspectives. So if you're reading a, say, Wikipedia article, which has a pronounced hard left bias on certain topics, you are not going to see citations or even the mention of alternate views unless it's as a caricature of what someone who actually believes that would say. You're not going to see a fair representation of all views there, right? And so one bias could be the absence of mentioning alternative perspectives, which is something that you'll probably get a lot at public school, for instance. Or you could have those presented in a way that incorrectly exaggerates weaknesses of that perspective. And there are a lot of other biases, but anyway, can you detect these things as you're reading it? And you have bias as well. And so, for example, there's a very strong preference for whatever it is you currently believe when you're learning about things that are competing ideas to what you currently believe. You're not going to give it a fair trial in most cases. You have to learn to subdue that tendency. And it's an honesty problem. And honesty is a big problem. What I mean by that is not just that it affects so much more than people give it credit for, but it's so much harder to squelch than people think. Then the final sub-question I want to talk about is, how completely can you process information? And what I mean by that is, when you do a little dive on a certain topic, what percentage of the pie do you end up with? Do you have a complete view of all known perspectives on this issue. And the way I would measure this is what I call functional proficiency. So can you solve problems in this space as a result of what you've looked up? And that could be as simple as answering a question, like how do you filter CO2 out of a room? So as a result of my research a few weeks ago, I ended up at the same level of what Elon Musk produced, which is, hey, turn on your HVAC fan and get a HEPA filter and put it in there. That's the best thing that you can do. In a room, you could actually do this with a box fan and a HEPA filter, which is just, it costs a couple of bucks, and you just put the filter on the fan, the air pressure will hold it there, and turn the fan on, and it will filter out your room air to the full extent of what's practical in any other way. And there you go, there's the solution. So that's functional proficiency on this problem. So I hope that this has been helpful. It wasn't a super deep dive on this, but I think it's enough to give you some things to work on. It turns out that it's immensely important to develop capabilities of mining the knowledge that we've been given so abundantly in our day and learning to process that well. It's not as easy as just hopping on the internet.